Okay, we should be live any second now. Oh, okay, great. Hi everyone. I'm Ian McLaughlin, a PhD candidate for now at the University of Pennsylvania, and my work focuses on mapping out the neuronal pathways responsible for the anxiety that's associated with addiction to a variety of drugs, from alcohol and nicotine to heroin and fentanyl. But also the anxiety that's associated with things like generalized anxiety disorder. And so this past week, for me, it was actually pretty reminiscent of the majority of my grad school experience, at least, for me. One experiment was a total complete flop for boring and stupid reasons. One experiment resulted in some of the most incredibly beautiful images I've ever seen. And the whole time I was preparing some more experiments that I'll be beginning next week. And so, by the way, the cool thing about these beautiful images that you get to generate in a neuroscience lab is not only are they intrinsically quite beautiful, but it's also oftentimes the first time any person has ever seen images like them in the history of humanity. And I know it's probably kind of boring to hear me just describe them without actually showing them, but I'm hoping to be able to show some samples here pretty soon. Anyways, so there's a story that's been developing over the past few months that has to do with biomedical science, my wheelhouse, but also public health and public policy, as well as politics. And I feel like it's a pretty accurate encapsulation of what we get wrong about regulating recreational drug use in the United States. So I want to discuss e-cigs, or vaping, or, there we go, or juuling, as the cool kids call it, or maybe used to call it. It's the only topic I'm planning on talking about today because it touches on not only some of the main focuses of my thesis research, addiction, but also the sort of interface of biomedical science and public policy, and again, particularly how mistakes can be made even with the best intentions driving them. So it's going to be a little bit on the long side, so buckle up. Anyway, so I suspect the regulatory responses that we've been seeing to e-cigs recently, that I submit to you is both inappropriate and ineffective, isn't isolated to the United States alone. So according to Stephanie Finlay at the Financial Times last month, India's cabinet announced a ban, as well as jail time of up to 3 years for those who manufacture, import, or sell products related to electronic cigarettes. Cambodia and Thailand both outlawed the use and import of e-cigs in 2014. And while it's not a ban, the Indonesian government imposed a 57% tax on import duties on e-cigs and e-cig liquids. And so while the Philippines hasn't introduced any new regulation, Finlay reports that the government is also pushing legislation that will raise taxes on e-cigs in a similar way. Similarly, she reports the following, so, quote, China, the largest producer and consumer of tobacco, halted online sales of vaping products made by U.S. vape maker Juul Labs. She also reports that, quote, Beijing was already gearing up to regulate the sector, fearing that e-cigs would ultimately create a new generation of nicotine addicts at a time when the government was trying to cut the proportion of the population older than 15 who smoke from more than 26.6% to 20% by 2030. And so, I'm just a scientist, but this ban on Juul strikes me as being much more motivated by business and economics more so than public health, given that this spate of tragedies in the United States that we're going to talk about in a second that sparked renewed attention on the increased use of e-cigs induced by vaping-related tragedies, right, appears to be largely unassociated with the major commercially available products. And so we'll talk about that again a little bit more later. But interestingly, while the U.S. has been rapidly moving to restrict the use of electronic cigarettes, the U.K. has been doing the exact opposite. Importantly, there hasn't been an outbreak of lung injuries related to vaping over there, which is a meaningful difference, of course. But it seems like the statistics of both smoking cigarettes and the use of nicotine-containing e-cigs are pretty different in the UK. And so as Katie Hunt reports, quote, concern about e-cigarette use as a gateway to smoking among young people wasn't supported by evidence in the UK, where regular vaping among young people who've never smoked is less than 1%. And then a spokesperson for Public Health England said, quote, similar choice of flavors exist in the US and UK, and yet we do not have the same levels of youth vaping here. Our much lower rates are due to our much stricter advertising regulations and possibly our lower nicotine cap, end quote. And so others have noted that e-cig companies really aren't able to achieve the kind of presence on social media or on TV in the UK as they can in the US. And so that might be a meaningful difference. And it's true that Juul, one of the most widely used and maybe the most widely used commercially available nicotine-containing e-cig on the market in the US, provides products that are more potent in the US. And so, as an example, according to Katie Hunt again, in the European Union, e-cig liquids are purportedly limited to no more than 20 mg per mil, or milligrams per milliliter. But in the US, Juul offers pods with liquid that contain 59 mg per mil, almost 3 times more potent. And so, but this is just part of the story. There's a pretty fundamental difference in how the governments of the US and UK approach e-cigs. And so Brad Rodu, or Raju, I'm probably mispronouncing like all of these last names, and I apologize for that. But so Brad is a professor of medicine at the University of Louisville in Kentucky and the endowed chair of tobacco harm reduction research. Brad says, quote, "I think the difference between the UK and the US are due to the American propensity to turn health issues into moral crusades." And then later he says, quote, "It appears that policymakers in the US are completely ignorant of the history of tobacco or completely ignore it." So, strong opinion. So in fact, in the UK, e-cigs have been touted as substantially useful smoking cessation aids, a goal that was put out by the UK government. And so Deborah Robson, who is a senior postdoc in tobacco addiction at King's College London, she said, quote, "The UK has a long history of adopting harm reduction approach for changing behavior and improving health. We have recognized based on empirical research for several decades that nicotine is not the harmful substance in tobacco. It's inhaling thousands of other toxic gases and particles of tar that come from setting fire to tobacco that harms and kills smokers." All right. So there are differences in the legality and potency of nicotine-containing products between the US and a lot of the rest of the world. And perhaps even the morality of nicotine use itself is distinct between these different parts of the world. But does that explain this alarmingly rapid increase in lung-related, life-threatening, and sometimes fatal injuries associated with e-cig use? And so the CDC posted an update, the Centers for Disease Control over here in the United States posted an update on the outbreak of lung injuries associated with e-cigarette use or vaping on October 3rd of this year, 2019. And by the way, if you're interested in following their progress, they update these stats every Thursday, which is pretty cool. But so here's the top level sort of summary. As of October 11th of this year, 1,299 lung injury cases associated with e-cigarette use or vaping products has been reported to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. 26 deaths have been confirmed, spread across 21 different states. All of those over 1,000 patients have had a history of using e-cigs or vaping products. About 70% of these patients were male, about 80% of the patients are under 35 years old, and 16% are under 18 years old. And so the specific chemicals causing the spate of lung injuries remain unknown as of yet. But here's where I feel like a lot of the reporting on this topic has fallen short. Most of the patients reported a history of using THC-containing products. And so there have been lung injury cases associated with e-cig use reported in 49 states and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so originally I was going to list all the states where this has happened, but clearly, this is just not a regionally limited phenomenon. Okay, so once we get a bit more granular on the details of these tragedies, at least at this stage, this still relatively early stage, it seems that the rapid changes in the regulation of e-cigs in the U.S. may be coming from a great place, but aimed in the wrong direction. And so here are some examples of the municipal or state-level regulatory responses to this wave of lung injuries attributed to the use of e-cigs. So Massachusetts has banned all vaping products. New York imposed emergency bans on flavored e-cigs. Rhode Island and Washington State have announced similar moves, the governors of both citing this lung disease outbreak. Michigan announced a ban on the sale of e-cigs. Oregon is planning to ban vaping products on October 15th for 6 months. Montana recently announced plans to issue sales bans on flavored e-cigs for 120 days. And San Francisco banned e-cigs, and California, the state in which San Francisco resides, is currently in the process of navigating sort of similar state-level legislation. And, there may very well be other examples of municipal or state policy responses, but given just these examples, there's been a pretty substantial regulatory response to e-cig use. And the question, though, is if the goal is to reduce these lung-related injuries and fatalities, will this response have any effect whatsoever? Or more importantly, maybe, could it actually exacerbate the problem? So the former FDA commissioner, the person who runs the FDA, essentially, the Food and Drug Administration, who stepped down earlier this year on April 5th, Scott Gottlieb, of whom I have some fairly significant critiques regarding some of the specific approvals that occurred while he was the commissioner. He noted that we're currently mixing things up in this response to e-cigs. He says, quote, "It seems there's too much conflating these tragic lung injuries with store-bought brands of regulated legal e-cigs like Juul and Enjoy, and far too little blaming THC, CBD, and bootleg nicotine vapes, where so far the only available hard evidence points. Some people may be getting sick from legal e-cigs. To save lives and make sound policy, we must follow science." So, in other words, what he's saying, it seems that these regulatory responses are like using a stick of dynamite to address a problem that something like a fishnet, would be better suited to solve. So, rather than just attacking the whole commercial e-cig industry at large, which doesn't appear to be generating most or maybe even any of these injuries, it seems like a better approach would be for some entity to test and monitor the contents of these e-cig liquids. And so it's worth noting probably at this point that the Trump administration has recently announced an intention to confront flavored e-cigs as well. And so Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced, quote, "The Trump administration is making it clear that we intend to clear the market of flavored e-cigarettes to reverse the deeply concerning epidemic of youth e-cigarette use that is impacting children, families, schools, and communities. We will not stand idly by as these products become an on-ramp to combustible cigarettes or nicotine addiction for a generation of youth." End quote. And so this was announced by the FDA, which falls under the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. You might have heard used before. So this was announced on September 11th of this year. And so this was, again, in response to preliminary numbers from the National Youth Tobacco Survey, which showed a continuing trend in the rates of the use of e-cigs among young people, and particularly non-tobacco flavors. And so their data showed that more than a quarter of high schoolers were current, meaning within the past 30 days, users of e-cigs in 2019, and the majority cited the use of fruit, menthol, or mint flavors. Okay. So then, Ned Sharpless, who's the current acting FDA commissioner after Scott Gottlieb stepped down, he said, quote, "We appreciate President Trump and Secretary Azar's continued support of the agency's effort to prevent youth use of e-cigarettes, including the bold approach we're announcing today. Once finalized, this compliance policy will serve as a powerful tool that the FDA can use to combat the troubling trend of youth e-cigarette use. We must act swiftly against flavored e-cigarette products that are especially attractive to children. Moreover, if we see a migration to tobacco-flavored products by kids, we will take additional steps to address youth use of these products." And so, obviously it was a long announcement. So he goes on to highlight the progress that was made in reducing the proportion of young people who smoke cigarettes. And so the e-cig market is facing some substantial regulatory attention, some of which has already been enacted at the municipal or state levels, but now they're looking at federal levels of regulation. And so all of that said, it's not like Juul, again, perhaps the most popular commercially available e-cig, with 3/4 of the market at the end of 2018, according to reports from January 2019. It's not like they're not fighting back. And so in June of 2018, just to give you some examples of what they're doing, they appointed a former chief counsel and principal deputy and acting chief counsel of the FDA as their chief legal officer. So, in other words, the person who's overseeing Juul's legal concerns had very senior positions within the FDA for quite a few years. Juul also hired a former communications official who worked in the White House, evidently closely with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, and he reportedly developed a reputation as a reliable crisis manager. This guy, the communications guy, is serving as the vice president of corporate communications. And then in July of this year, Juul announced that they hired Dr. Mark Rubenstein. a physician who specializes in adolescent medicine and a former researcher at the University of California, San Francisco Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. So this former researcher and physician is now their chief or their executive medical officer. And so, I should know the University of California, San Francisco is one of the best biomedical institutions in the world. They have a great neuroscience program, very highly respected. And so, according to the LA Times, quote, Juul said Rubenstein would oversee research on underage use of vapor products, guide the company's youth prevention programs and policy positions, and help form links with the public health community. The LA Times article also highlighted that Rubenstein's colleagues were disturbed by this move and skeptical of Juul's motivations. So Bonnie Halpern Felsher, who's a professor at Stanford who studies teen vaping, and who actually helped train Rubenstein, she said, even if you believe in harm reduction, to go to work for a tobacco company, to me, goes against everything that anybody doing control should believe in. On the other hand, Dr. Neil Benowitz, a professor at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, who's very well known in the addiction and nicotine fields. I've cited his work multiple times in my peer-reviewed publications. Benowitz said he was shocked by Rubenstein's job change, but he's hopeful that e-cigs will help people quit smoking, and he wants them to stay on the market until more research is done. Juul hired another person who worked for the FDA for several decades to be the director of risk mitigation and compliance, as well as former assistant secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services as their primary lobbyist. And so before Scott Gottlieb, again, he was the former commissioner of the FDA, before he stepped down, he said, quote, there's an elaborate lobbying campaign in Washington pushing back on the actions we're doing. Okay, so now while all of this hiring was going on, Juul wasn't actually spending all that much on lobbying compared to other companies that sell nicotine delivery systems, from cigars and cigarettes to e-cigs. And some of these names might be familiar. Philip Morris International, for example, the company that owns Marlboro, Parliament, Virginia Slims, and a bunch of, other cigarettes that you see all over the place, they spent about $3 million on lobbying. Philip Morris, by the way, owns a minority stake in Juul. I have some, just to give you an idea, I don't know if you can see that, but this is sort of just a breakdown of some of the main companies that, and what they spent on lobbying. You can see maybe Philip Morris wasn't even the biggest spender. Altria Group, previously known as Philip Morris Companies, spent nearly $5 million on lobbying. And Altria owns a bunch of tobacco companies like the one that makes Black and Mild, and then things like chewing tobacco and snus, and stuff like that, smokeless tobacco. And wouldn't you know it, guess where the newest CEO of Juul worked before Juul? Altria Group. And he's only one of several former Altria folks that Juul's taken on board. And so I'm sure, most of the people, I can take this down now. Let's go back to this lovely Juul. That is what the Juul looks like, the Juul e-cig. So I'm pretty sure most of the people who would stumble on this video are maybe too young to remember the very public confrontation of the government with the tobacco industry several decades ago. But it was a very big fight. There's sort of a dramatization of it. Thank You for Smoking. It's a pretty fun movie to watch if you're interested. But so, given that Juul has been literally hiring people from both like the legacy tobacco industry as well as from the very agencies that they're going to be confronting more and more in the near future, it seems like they're anticipating a very similar fight in the near future. There's a whole bunch of other big business machinations. There's like a merger between Altria and Philip Morris that was kind of soured by this regulatory response to e-cigs. But suffice it to say, this fight is far from over, and it's tough to predict what's actually going to ultimately happen. But if you're still with me, you might remember that I suggested it might be prudent to empower a federal agency to monitor the contents of e-cig liquids to ensure they don't contain chemicals that we know are toxic when vaporized. And so, the next logical question would be, monitor for what? And so if I had like a magic FDA wand, here's what I would love to have tested. So it's pretty well known at this point that there's a huge variety of flavors for e-cigs, from like green apple and mango to like bacon and crab legs. I think I saw hot dog, chicken and waffles. I remember seeing, and then my favorite, Worcestershire sauce. And that's just to name a few. There's a bunch. And apart from that being like pretty just impressive, like objectively from like a chemistry standpoint and like a biochemistry standpoint, no one's really tested what happens chemically when these various flavoring molecules are exposed to temperatures that e-cigs have to reach to vaporize nicotine. And so, like quite literally, to get your brain to believe it's inhaling a green apple, molecules have to be present in the vapor that ultimately hits or tickles your olfactory bulb in the same way any smell or taste ultimately does. And so it could very well be the case that many, if not most, of these molecules don't undergo a reaction that generates a carcinogenic compound or a cancer-causing compound, but some of them almost certainly do. And there's no reason we can't figure out which are which and ensure that, we prohibit the use of flavorants that do create known carcinogens when vaporized. These tests could be simple to perform. There's also no standardization of what kinds of e-cig liquids can be sold. And I'm sure, the idea of having the government regulate what can and can't be sold as e-cig liquids would strike a lot of the current enthusiasts as quite literally a buzzkill. But then again, all the data point towards this wave of lung injuries from e-cigs being attributed to poorly produced e-cig liquid. And so, I don't pretend to know what the best answer to this question ultimately will be, but what I do know is that any company that intends to profit from a product that's ingested by one of the most, critically important organs upon which we rely to survive second to second with every breath, they should be required to demonstrate that their product doesn't damage that same organ. And so, just set up some minimal quality control standards. You want to open up a restaurant, you have to meet some standard health requirements so people don't get sick from your food. And the same should be true for e-cigs. And so the conversation and political response we're watching take place right now, it seems kind of simple, but it's kind of driven by three separate public health concerns. And there's a bit of a problem in many cases that they're all sort of being combined into one response. And so the most immediate concern is this wave of severe lung injuries that almost certainly seem to be associated with vaping, but not necessarily commercially available vaping products. And so another concern is the unknown long-term consequences of long-term use of e-cigs. And then the last is the fact that a bunch of companies have undeniably profited from young people who'd be otherwise uninterested in nicotine-containing products. And, since the e-cig company Juul has sort of come to represent the e-cig industry in general, just given how much of the market they've captured, I think we can summarize the issue in one sentence. Juul doesn't seem to play a significant role, perhaps no role whatsoever, in this spate of, tragic lung injuries, but does play a significant and arguably causative role in the rapid rise of e-cig use among young people. And so Juul and similar companies, they don't, again, really appear to be significantly involved in, the over 1,000, I think the number was 1,299 lung injuries related to vaping. And so, there's just barely any evidence that products like Juul e-cigs play any causative role whatsoever in these injuries. That said, Juul and its competitors do play a central and causative role in the other public health concern, the precipitous rise in the use of these products among young people. And so, I totally understand, and I mean, I work in a lab where we research e-cigs and the effects, the neurobiological distinctions that arise from just smoking a cigarette with obviously nicotine in it and vaping with a tasty flavor like green apple. So I see this opinion expressed all the time. A lot of them will say, well, sort of think along the lines or say things like, listen, I don't think kids should be using these things anyway, so go ahead and ban them. But the reason that this is concerning is summed up pretty well by Jonathan Foulds, an addiction researcher and tobacco specialist at Penn State University in an AP article. Quote, "This could take us from potentially the single biggest improvement in public health in the United States towards a public health disaster in which cigarettes continue to be the dominant nicotine product." And so, what Dr. Foulds is referring to is that e-cigs are still seen as an alternative to cold turkey quitting for smokers. They're a very effective nicotine delivery system and can be one of the tools on the tool belt that includes things like Nicorette gum or, nicotine lozenges or just nicotine gum. Nicorette is a brand. But, there's a variety of other substitutes for the nicotine that people would otherwise be getting from cigarettes when they're trying to quit. Smoking cigarettes remains the leading cause of preventable death worldwide. Even smokeless tobacco consumption is associated with increased risks of cancer. And so, there's a very real risk that an outright ban may result in an increase in the consumption of cigarettes, which would be predictably counterproductive. And so there's also a concern that these bans may just result in the expansion of a black market. So, for example, in Canada, where similar regulatory responses have occurred and are continuing to be considered, a concern for the expansion of the black market has been expressed by a researcher of chronic disease and vaping, who's also an expert on tobacco control policy, named David Hammond. Hammond said, quote, "We can't wish them away. To the extent that we have many, many Canadians using these products, I don't think pushing those folks outside the legal market makes sense." And so, of course, similar concerns have been expressed in the U.S., where there was already a thriving e-cig market that predated companies like Juul. And, there's every reason to believe that banning the sale of products like the ones that companies like Juul makes or Enjoy makes, that they'll just drive users in two directions. Some will just purchase replacement products on what would either be a gray market or maybe a black market, like online, to get similar flavors and similar products to continue vaping what they're used to, but just with lower oversight, lower regulation, lower opportunities for regulation. And then others will be pushed to just going back to the product that they were used to in the first place, which was cigarettes. And, I can't say with 100% confidence that e-cigs are a healthier alternative to cigarettes, but the UK government is pretty confident. And I doubt most advocates of smoking cessation would consider the transition from e-cigs to cigarettes to be a beneficial one. There was more, there's been some pushback among some senators on, both Democrats and Republicans, like Richard Burr, who's a senator from North Carolina, basically expressed this is moving too fast. Interestingly, he said this at a tobacco conference, but it's not like this unified response from the federal government. And so, but by and large, that was my overly long sort of soapbox speech on e-cigs. And so, I could go on, but that largely sums up the concern. I was going to talk about the whole popcorn lung scare that happened at some point last year, which was horribly communicated, mishandled by really irresponsible media companies, online media companies mostly, who were just hunting for clicks. That was largely a myth, but this, spate of over 1,000 lung injuries and, dozens of fatalities, that's very real. But, I think largely, what I said has summed it up. But there is one more thing that I learned while reading into this, the latest developments on this issue. And so it has to do with the management of folks who are injured by these vaping products, right? So even if a ventilator, which is literally a machine that'll breathe for you, it'll literally breathe for you, moving air in and out of the lungs for you, even if that machine is unable to provide enough oxygen to keep a person alive, there is another option available to get oxygen where it needs to be. And so this was a system, a technology that was in 2012 it was invented in 2012 at Boston Children's Hospital in collaboration with a bunch of other medical institutions. And it's basically a procedure that enables intravenous delivery of oxygen, which is wild. And I know anyone who's even superficially familiar with injections would instinctually react with skepticism. Injection of air into the vascular system can be extremely dangerous and is assiduously avoided in clinical procedures, right? But this isn't that. So what this group developed is a system using lipid-based microparticles that are sort of devised to encapsulate super tiny amounts of oxygen. And so it's not like injecting air bubbles into the circulatory system. It's more like injecting a super duper fine foam, and it can make a gigantic difference in whether somebody can survive these rather severe damage, injuries to the lung. And it's actually very, very efficient in transferring oxygen to tissues. All right, but I think that largely covers it. It's going to be something that I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes on. I think, those three primary concerns about e-cig use dynamics, and then, of course, this rash of lung injuries, those continue to be real concerns. And, I think more often than not, when it comes to particularly policy surrounding drug use, like recreational drug use, these very rapid and reflexive responses, while maybe politically popular, just aren't really justified by evidence or actual biomedical science. And so, I hope that we can take it a little bit slower and then wait for the kind of studies that labs like mine are going to generate. Like, is there a significant difference in the neurobiological encoding of reward that people experience when they use an e-cig versus when they smoke a cigarette? It's more complicated than just how, like, the concentration of tobacco, or I'm sorry, the concentration of nicotine from either tobacco or from e-cigs that will distinguish how rewarding these products are potentially. And so, I hope that the government will wait for that kind of evidence, that evidence at that level of granularity before just deciding, this whole potential tool is now banned. So that's what I got for you. That's e-cigs. I'll take down the Juul picture now. By the way, there are, like, if you're not familiar with e-cigs at all, there are many, many, many different like vaporizing platforms that are available, some of which are very discreet. Some of them are very the opposite of discreet. It's like you're carrying like sort of a steampunk lightsaber. But regardless, they all deliver the same product. They're just a nicotine delivery system, or in the case, very frequently the case among these people who are injured, either THC containing vapor or CBD or other things. All right, so now why don't we go live? Hi everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD candidate for now at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study my research focuses on the neurobiology of anxiety and addiction, and I just did this whole long screed on electronic cigarettes and vaping on YouTube. If you're interested in that, check it out on YouTube. I think if you just type like my name, Ian McLaughlin, and then brain, I should come up, or at least my channel should come up. It's called Anthropoid, but the channel is called Anthropoid, but I don't think you can get there by just like typing Anthropoid because of that movie. So if you're interested, go check that out. Otherwise, the girls are out for a walk right now. They might come back while we're still chatting. If you hear some random vocalizations, my daughter is now she like moves from different sounds that she fixates on and then just like repeats them. And the latest one is like doing super high pitched squeaks. So if you hear that, it's not like an animal. It's my daughter who just came back from a walk. Hello, Eleonora. Hello, everybody. Hey, what's up, Joy? Hey, it's Ian. Hey, it's Joy. Happy Sunday to you too, Michelle. Oh gosh, I just knocked a bunch of stuff. What's up, JC Chicago? How are you? What can be the effects of drinking heavily to your brain 3 times a week? Sure. So, I should stop doing that. So I assume, of course, you're referring to alcohol or ethanol. And drinking heavily, so what defines heavy drinking can be defined differently, and definitely, different cultures have different sort of perceptions of what heavy drinking really means. And it actually evolves over time. And the reason I say that, the reason I mention this is, of course, I don't know if you're from the United States, but, the standards in Australia and South Korea are different from the standards in, other parts of the world, like, Scandinavia or whatever. So about 1 liter of 40% liquor. Yeah, so 40% liquor is basically what we would call like 80 proof. And that's like, most vodka is 80 proof or 40% ethanol. But also, most whiskeys are as well, at least in that ballpark. Some are a little bit stronger. But okay, so 3 times a week, heavy drinking. So there is a difference in the neurobiology, or just the biology, the biological reaction to a large volume of alcohol at one time compared to small amounts over an extended period of time. In other words, like, while the amount of alcohol in a shot, let's say a vodka, it can be equivalent to about a full glass of beer or a glass of wine, the difference is that when you're drinking beer, or one of the differences is that when you're drinking beer or drinking wine, you're usually not chugging it, right? You're sort of sipping on it. And when you take a shot, usually you're not sipping on the shot, you're just slamming, right? And so same dose of alcohol, but the difference is that you absorb that shot, of course, the alcohol from that shot far more rapidly than you do, the extended ingestion of wine or beer. And so as a result, to the brain, the brain is being exposed to a far higher dose at one time of alcohol. So that's, one important difference. And so as a result, like just regarding, the immediate reaction, you get drunker faster, you get inebriated faster. But then metabolically, as you're sort of digesting and absorbing the alcohol, there are various enzymes that are involved in this sort of convergent metabolism of alcohol into other molecules. And you only have so much of these enzymes. Those enzymes can become overloaded. And in fact, one of the theories of a hangover is that one of those enzymes, if you drink an amount of alcohol at one time that sort of dominates or overextends, goes beyond what your enzymatic capacity to metabolize that alcohol is, that's when you get the onset of hangover symptoms. Okay, so, but when you're talking about what it sounds like you're more concerned about is sort of chronic binge drinking, essentially. And the alcohol, it's sort of, I just talked about nicotine and e-cigs on YouTube, right? And nicotine is, a recreationally used drug, and so is alcohol. And it's sort of wild that we have a drug like cannabis be completely as illegal as a drug can be at the federal level in the United States, while alcohol is legal to use. You can buy as much of it as you so please. You can buy enough to kill yourself, whereas cannabis is not. Or you can't do that with cannabis. The reason that's wild is that cannabis and THC and cannabinoids, broadly speaking, and there are some exceptions here, are far more benign biologically than alcohol is. By that, I mean THC, CBD, cannabis in general does not seem to destroy neurons, to cause neuronal cell death. It doesn't seem to disrupt, vitamin and mineral absorption like alcohol can. And it does have some long-term consequences, but most of them don't appear to be permanent. And while not all of the neurobiological responses to chronic alcohol use are necessarily permanent, they can be extremely long-lasting, and some of them can be permanent. So, when I mentioned like nutrient absorption, vitamin absorption, what can happen when somebody drinks like that regularly is the development of something called Korsakoff syndrome, which is this very interesting syndrome that the reason that it's always stuck out in my memory is that one of the symptoms of Korsakoff's is confabulation, where people will essentially utter lies. They'll, if you ask them a question, they will lie, but they'll believe their own lie. They're just completely fabricating this experience that they had or this answer, and they don't know that they're lying. And some of that some of that syndrome arises from the fact that alcohol chronically used can disrupt how you absorb vitamin B. Okay, so now the toxic effect of alcohol, as I mentioned, can induce neuronal cell death, can be neurotoxic, but it also will inhibit things like synaptogenesis, neurogenesis in the select few parts of the brain where neurogenesis continues to occur into adulthood, like the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. Chronic alcohol use can influence that negatively. And of course, for those 3 days when you're binge drinking, like essentially any other drug, but alcohol certainly included, when you go to sleep, your progression through your sleep cycles is pretty fundamentally disrupted. And so you don't have a sort of natural progression from, early stages of sleep into REM sleep. And it seems to essentially just completely eliminate what's called slow wave activity or the sort of deepest sleep that we experience. And there's a bunch of important biological activity that occurs only when we're sleeping. And so as a result, if you're going to bed, drunk either every night or during those binge nights, you're not having that sort of that recuperative activity that really only occurs when we're sleeping. And so, so it can be toxic in the central nervous system. It can be toxic in the metabolic system or the gastrointestinal system. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not healthy if that's what you were concerned over. Okay, what amount of ghee? Oh, I can't remember what ghee is. I remember the word, but I'm sorry to say I don't recall what it is. Alcohol is destroying my life. I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, addiction is extraordinarily difficult to treat successfully. There are, however, there are resources available that are moderately effective for some, quite effective for some, available, and that's certainly the case for alcohol. And so, you might have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's a bunch of stigma and associated with it. A lot of people have a sort of negative perception of it, and some of that is earned. But Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, is just one model of a sort of consistent model that exists, which is, you join this group, you go there for a singular purpose, which is to maintain sobriety or try to achieve sobriety, and you're sort of you're included in a social support network of people who are all interested in achieving that same goal, and that can make a huge difference in terms of success in staying abstinent for long periods of time. So, I mean, even if you aren't sure that you want to stop drinking, you can go to these groups and just see what it's about, and who knows. And so, particularly if it's destroying your life, I mean, that is the definition of addiction. When somebody continues engaging in a behavior, taking a drug, despite the fact that they know there are negative consequences of that behavior. And so, that is something that distinguishes an addict from what you might call like a functioning addict, or, somebody who regularly consumes a drug, gets intoxicated by the drug, but their life isn't deteriorating in any significant way. But so what you're talking about is addiction. And so you should definitely join one of these groups. Check it out. See what it's about. And of course, there are addiction medicine specialists who have devoted their lives to competently helping people in your position. All right, we are getting We are getting a call in. I have my paper from somebody, I believe, who's named Becky. So Becky, is that your name? And if it is, where are you calling from?
From Australia. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Yes, I can hear you, Becky. From Australia. What's on your mind? Oh no. We got disconnected. Wait. Are you still there? Darn it. Becky, it looks like you just got disconnected, but so do feel free to call back in. All right. Is your pint half full or half empty? At the moment, it's totally empty. But I might have a beer later on tonight. Yeah, Becky, it looks like you hung up. All right. Is it possible to have high tolerance to liquor but rarely drink it? Doesn't seem possible to me. That is a really interesting phenomenon. So, tolerance is a specific thing biologically, at least at the level of the brain. When neuropharmacologists or neuroscientists talk about tolerance, what they're referring to is adaptations that occur following recurrent use of a drug. Okay, it looks like Becky might be calling back in. Yes. Why is it doing that? There we go. So back to tolerance after that, because that's a really interesting topic. Now let's see if this if we can connect with Becky this time. All right, so Becky, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. What's on your mind?
I have a friend that's actually undergoing, or about to undergo brain surgery. We've got the top neurosurgeons here in Australia on the case. She actually went to John Hunter Hospital here and has a large mass on the left-hand side of her brain. She didn't notice anything until about headaches until a week before. That's the only thing that sort of gave it away. And she had no loss of strength in extremities or anything like that. Basically, she got raced to John Hunter Hospital because she was at risk for seizure, of course. And they were stumped as to what it was. They've taken 8 samples from her brain and some, what do you call them things that go into your spine?
The spinal tap?
Yeah, yep, that's it. Some fluid out of the spinal tap. And the Newcastle surgeons are all stumped. They were actually calling her the mystery girl. And some of the surgeons there are the best in Australia. So yesterday they went to a meeting where they went to Newcastle, and her and her sister went down and FaceTimed the best surgeons in Australia in Sydney. Now, I haven't heard exactly what come back from that, but I think as far as I've heard, it's all still been a bit of a mystery, and they don't know how to attack it, sort of thing, or what it could be, or like they still don't know what it is.
Jeez.
It's been ruled out as cancerous. It's just a mass.
Okay.
And yeah, so like described these other bits around it as fuzzy bits, like they had little like fuzzy bits, so they thought it might have been infection at first around it, but that got ruled out. So yeah, it's like really a mystery here at the moment, and all the head neurosurgeons in Australia are stumped.
I mean, that you know, my training is not in medicine, and so if they're stumped, I'm most certainly stumped.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, I'm sure it's cold comfort, but you know, if they have ruled out, if they've taken a biopsy of this mass and they've ruled out cancer, that is a very good sign.
Yeah.
But in terms of like other things it could be, you know, I have no insights for you. And I mean, it sounds like she's in great hands. You know, of course, the thing to pay attention to is, do other faculty, has she noticed any, you know, deterioration in memory, or in, you know, does she have odd sensation? You know, you said the left side of the brain. Of course, the brain is a very large neighborhood. And so depending upon where on the left hemisphere it is, you can have a whole variety of different abnormalities. But, you know, that they can be relatively subtle changes in your sort of day-to-day life, but they can be an indication of something changing. And so, but yeah, I mean, beyond that, you know, my training is in science, and so you know.
Yeah, it's definitely because I think from what I read, I can't remember exactly, so don't quote me. That it's like for the left side of the brain, like is your like sort of controls some of your perception to mouth. Observational.
Sure.
Sort of stuff.
So generally speaking, that would probably indicate that it's close to the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the way, you know, somatosensation, and what we're talking about there is like the feeling of touch, and, you know, sort of changes in the disposition of different parts of the body. The way it's laid out in the brain is very weird. There's like a map of our body along this strip right about here, and so if there's a mass in that area, you can have all kinds of strange symptoms. But I mean, you know, Becky, I wish I had better insights for you. But you know, best of luck to your friend.
Fine. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for accepting my call. I really, really appreciate it.
No, it was my pleasure. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Oh wow, I have to I just like put my hand over the camera. Sorry about that, everybody. All right. Sorry, I didn't have more interesting insights there. Back to tolerance. Okay, so somebody previously asked, before I was finally able to connect with Becky, is it possible to have a tolerance to a drug, let's just say alcohol? I think the person brought up alcohol specifically, despite the fact that that person doesn't really drink very frequently. And I began by mentioning that the tolerance means something specific in the context of neurobiology. And so, you know, what we wouldn't call that necessarily tolerance, but there are definitely differences in the way that different biological systems, different people, will respond to the same drug. And, you know, there are different reasons for that. One of the most interesting at the moment is called pharmacogenetics. And so, you know, here's a simple sort of way to maybe communicate this. So there are some people who find opioids like morphine or codeine, you know, or oxycodone or even fentanyl extremely rewarding, right? They love these drugs. In fact, you know, they'll say things like, "I've never felt this normal before. I feel, excited and you know, vivacious and vigorous," right? And so, it generally speaking, people who react to opioids in that way are generally at a risk of developing addiction. But there is a very large proportion of people who react almost to the opposite. They feel dizzy, they feel nauseous, they feel dysphoric, the opposite of euphoric. They feel stupid, and they just cannot wait until they can stop taking those opioids. So that's a pretty stark difference in the way that two people respond to the same drug. And in fact, I've seen that exhibited in my own family, where one of my parents reacts to opioids very positively and, just sort of enjoys it. And, they're just sort of in a good mood and very sort of gregarious. And then my other parent just hates them, cannot wait to stop taking them. I believe I am among the former category. I believe I inherited those genetics. And when I say inherited those genetics, what we think is a very large determining factor in why it is that some people respond the ways they do is we have genes that encode for receptors, neurotransmitter receptors. You might have heard of serotonin or dopamine. These are molecules that bind receptors similarly, though not exactly, but similarly to the way a key fits into a lock, right? You can't, it's more complicated than the lock and key system, but you can sort of think of it that way, right? Well, when a drug is capable, most drugs are capable of having an effect making you feel euphoric, generally speaking, that molecule, that drug molecule, is binding one of those neurotransmitter receptors. It doesn't necessarily bind in the same way that the normal chemical that our brain produces binds, but it still interacts with those same receptors. And so we have genes that encode for those receptors. And those genes are a sequence of, A, T, C's, and G's, essentially. And while, they're largely the same among different people, there can be very minuscule differences. You can have an A where a T is, or you can have an A where a G is supposed to be, or something like that. Just slight differences that translate, quite literally, biology joke right there, into similar function, right? The receptors almost look identical, but they're slightly different. And so what that then translates to is when a molecule binds that receptor, in one person, the receptor responds in this way, whereas in the other person, it responds more like this way, right? And so when it comes to, so that's what we mean by pharmacogenetics, where the pharmacology, the biological things that a drug does are different based in, dependent upon different genetic landscapes. So when it comes to alcohol, what you're really describing is somebody is able to ingest a larger amount of alcohol before demonstrating inebriation, right? So they don't slur their speech, they don't get sort of wobbly, but that doesn't mean that they're not under the influence of the drug and their judgment is still impaired. It's just because the way that their unique biological landscape within their brain responds to that same molecule is just slightly different than yours. And so that can be actually rather dangerous, right? Because somebody might come under the assumption or develop the assumption that they're able to drink large amounts of alcohol, and hey, they can, and they can still come across as totally competent and not, just wasted. But at the level of their metabolic system, at the level of the peripheral organ system, it's still a large amount of alcohol. And while their brain may be responding competently, their gastrointestinal system, their liver, their kidneys are still having to deal with this massive amount of alcohol that would, put down another person, make them pass out. And so as a result, they can ingest more toxic amounts of alcohol under the assumption that, hey, it just doesn't affect me very much. So it's not quite tolerance, though you're right that they can tolerate larger amounts of the alcohol before becoming inebriated. It's just a difference in the way that their unique brain reacts to the same drug that you or I would take. Does cigarettes affect the brain? Evangelist Dejan Scott. Yes, absolutely. The only reason that somebody would ever smoke a cigarette is because the molecules within the cigarettes do indeed affect the brain, nicotine in particular. Nicotine is like the main active ingredient in tobacco, which is what is usually in cigarettes and cigars and pipes and stuff. But what's interesting, and I didn't realize this until I was doing a literature review for my first peer-reviewed publication. So when somebody's smoking cigarettes, when they've been smoking for a while and they're dependent upon the cigarettes, perhaps addicted to the cigarettes, and they decide they want to stop smoking, and they're like, hey, there's these e-cigs now on the market that you can get very easily at Walgreens or whatever. Why don't I just use those? That way I'm not inhaling the combustion byproducts of smoking a cigarette. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that is indeed a healthy switch. In fact, in the United Kingdom, it's a recommended alternative to cigarettes. They're very sort of avidly pushing the use of e-cigs over cigarettes. But what's interesting is that despite the fact that there's still nicotine being delivered by the e-cigs, people still undergo withdrawal. So they still have withdrawal symptoms, despite the fact that they're still consuming nicotine, maybe even more nicotine than they used to. And that's because there are others, what we call psychoactive molecules in tobacco that influence the subjective effects of a cigarette. Some of them, for example, are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs. You might be familiar with MAOIs because it's really not as common anymore, but it was one of the sort of tools in the tool belt of antidepressant medication. And so as a result, when you're vaping an e-cig, you're not getting all of those molecules. By the way, I did this whole long screed on e-cigs on YouTube if you want to check it out, and sort of like specifically about this big spate of over 1,299 people who have developed lung injuries from e-cigs, and several dozen fatalities. So on YouTube, my channel I think is called Anthropoid, but you can probably find me by just doing like Ian McLaughlin. Super easy last name to spell, I know, right? Just a bunch of Irish consonants. And just type like Ian McLaughlin neuroscience. All right. By the way, Zaina, I failed to say hello. Hello, Zaina. How are you? I hope all is well. Becky, thank you so much for the super hearts. It's extremely sweet of you. Oh, and Sherry, lovely to see you. And I really appreciate the super hearts. Very generous of you both. All right, I got a concussion 3 weeks ago, and the symptoms are not going away, getting worse. Is this normal? And then the crying emoji. So, is it normal? Yes, it's normal, but it is not a good sign. So, generally speaking, the time, and I should always say, I'm not a physician, not trained as a physician, not going to become a physician. I'm a PhD candidate about to finish. I will no longer be able to. I've hit this thing 2 times with my gesticulations. Chill. I will no longer be able to call myself a PhD candidate because I will be awarded the PhD within a few months, knock on wood. Anyways, so the recovery times from concussion can vary pretty widely. It can be just 1 week. It can be a month. It can be years. And generally speaking, and this is kind of like a weird way to think about it, but the longer the symptoms last, the longer they're likely to last. And so, listen, if you still have symptoms and you haven't seen a physician, you should immediately, today, tomorrow, as soon as you can, without breaking the bank, obviously, which is a remarkable thing that we have to consider that in the United States. Go see a physician, and almost certainly your primary care physician will refer you to get neuroimaging done because their concussions are no joke. That is an injury to the brain. And the brain is, I would argue, the most personal and most important part of your existence. The only reason you can think about your existence is because of your brain. And so, yeah, go see a physician. But that doesn't mean just because you've had these symptoms for 3 weeks that all hope is lost. It is important to see a physician who can help guide you through various kinds of therapy and mitigating the likelihood of you having a second concussion. Because after you've had 1 concussion, you're vulnerable. You're sort of outside of this window, but you're more vulnerable to a second concussion. And depending on your age, if you're young, if you're like in your adolescence, teens are even more vulnerable to concussions than adults, which is kind of like this cruel joke because, of course, teens tend to behave a little bit more recklessly, take it from me in my teenage years, than adults do. So it is normal, but it's not good normal. All right. So life is good, people. I can see your comments, but you seem overly enthusiastic. So I get the feeling that you're trying to troll me, and I please forgive me if I'm wrong about that. Okay. I know I missed a lot of topics here. I'd be S-faced after that amount. It is remarkable, like what kind of tolerance you can develop to drugs that are otherwise extremely potent. Particularly, I agree, alcohol is wild. Like the tolerance that somebody can develop to massive volumes and doses of alcohol is mind blowing. But for me, what I think demonstrates tolerance the most effectively is that somebody who consumes opioids, again, like oxycodone or hydrocodone and things like Vicodin or OxyContin or fentanyl, if somebody consumes those drugs regularly, they have to, and they do it for recreational purposes, or if they're being treated for chronic pain, they have to sort of continually escalate the amount that they consume to achieve the same either therapeutic effect or recreational effect. And so you can have somebody consuming, 160 or more milligrams of oxycodone in OxyContin in a day or more. Whereas if you were to give, in other words, they will have to consume an amount that is otherwise could be fatal in another person. And that's just because they've biologically adapted to the chronic presence of the drug. In other words, developed a tolerance. So when I almost went on a tangent when I was talking about my peer-reviewed publications, one of the reasons I remain a PhD candidate is that my committee, the sort of panel of wizards who dress as wizards and determine whether or not you are prepared and finished. You're finished with your PhD. One of them asked me to add a chapter to my dissertation, which is already like 400 pages long, about the relationship between serotonin signaling and anxiety, which is very critical to my thesis project. And I'm glad he did. And he's like, it's sort of like he's like the Gandalf of serotonin. Like he knows everything about serotonin. He was like one of the main guys who demonstrated how SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, work. But as a result, I've learned this really interesting body of literature that explains the distinctions between why it is that we have different sort of behavioral repertoires that are enacted when we perceive various threats at literal different physical distances. It's called the brain defense system. It's very cool. Happy to talk about that if you guys give me an excuse. I'm almost a wizard. Yeah, I'm working on it. You appear to have held up well. How are you? I'm okay. A little sleep deprived, but that is par for the course when you have a 9-month-old daughter who just wants to check on you about every hour and a half or so, whether she's sleeping or not, just wants to make sure that you're still around. And so my wife and I are still adapting. But she's awesome. I mean, I'm kidding, really. But as a result, I don't really get very much sleep. Okay, we have a caller. It's a little bit of a mysterious profile picture, so prepare yourself. This might be a troll. Igor, is that your name? And if so, where are you calling from?
Yes, sir. How are you, sir? How are you? What's going on?
I'm doing well. Where are you calling from?
I'm from New York City, New York.
Oh, great. Okay, so Igor from New York. What's on your mind?
On my mind is when you said something about the GABA, the transmitters, and the neuron systems. What do you mean by? Because there's people think I was trolling. I'm just writing here, commenting. I'm not a troll. Okay. I'm not a corporate. I'm not to hurt anybody. I'm in healthcare. I help people. I physically healthcare and radiologists work side by side. And there's certain things that was mentioned here and is mentioned in the comments. I feel like it's not right. That's why I kind of want to not to you. You're doing an amazing job. But the people who's commenting, they need more of support and guidance and more to, because you're a doctor from what I assume, and I'm a helper with a doctor technician. So we can work together as a healthcare under HIPAA law.
So I mean, is there a specific topic that came up for you?
For me, no, because I've dealt, but the topic that came not from me, but from your commentators that was there. You have 58 commentators that is saying things about diet. And so I answered from what I can, but I don't have a question. I just here it's Sunday fun day. I just came to church. I don't have no kids, no family. I read. I have a book, and I figured let me go on and watch this guy because he seems into science, and he claims to be a doctor or soon to be a doctor. And I just happened to just come in here and see what is happening. That's it.
Well, you're welcome to hang out, man. I appreciate it. And if any specific point comes up where you feel like you have something to add, please call back in. But otherwise, it's great to hear from you. Thanks for calling in, man.
No problem. Thank
you. Igor from New York City, New York. Very cool. How do you feel about weed? So, I mean, again, I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience, and actually our lab has begun studying THC. We have actually an undergrad who's doing a research project with us, specifically THC in vaporizers, right? But so how I feel about cannabis is sort of meaningless. It doesn't really matter, right? what matters to me is what the evidence tells us about the public health consequences potentially of legalizing cannabis. And what those data suggest, first of all, is that cannabis is a far more benign substance than essentially any other recreationally used drug that is legal. I mean, it's not like there's that many, but alcohol and tobacco. Both of those are pretty demonstrably more toxic, particularly over the long-term use, when compared to cannabis. So there's just that, right? The epidemiology, in other words, the public health statistics suggest that regular use of cannabis is just far less toxic, associated with far fewer hospitalizations and so on. So just get that out of the way. So I support not only decriminalizing, but legalizing cannabis, regulated just like we regulate alcohol. In fact, almost identically to the way we regulate alcohol. Tax it, regulate it, and so on. But then beyond that, there's enough evidence at this point to suggest that not only is cannabis more benign just for recreational use, but it also, for some folks, has some therapeutic effects. So, for example, some folks who have chronic pain, and chronic pain can arise from a variety of different maladies, but some folks, they can use cannabis to mitigate the severity of their pain, such that they no longer have to consume what are potentially more dangerous drugs, certainly more addictive drugs, like opioid painkillers. Now, I don't have anything against opioid painkillers. They're extremely useful tools. They're actually not particularly effective for chronic pain, which is kind of a misconception, but we don't have that many tools available to treat chronic pain. So, and quality of life, at least in my mind, is the most important, index, or the most important measurement of the utility of a given drug. But so, listen, if it works for somebody who has chronic pain, power to them. It also, of course, for some folks with treatment-resistant epilepsy, has been shown to mitigate the severity of seizures or reduce the frequency of seizures. And so these are folks who have, tried other anti-epileptic drugs or anti-seizure drugs, and either they don't work to mitigate their seizures, or, and it's always important to remember, a lot of these anti-seizure drugs have some pretty substantial side effects. And, who are we to dictate what is a tolerable side effect or an intolerable side effect? I think it makes more sense, given that cannabis is a fairly benign drug in the context of drugs that are used, let the patient decide. But, under the guidance and, advice of a physician. So, we could go on and on, but so, that's how I feel about cannabis, which is meaningless, but it's informed by the sort of public health data that have been collected over the years, as well as just the neurobiology of cannabis. All right. Can you talk about neuron in the gut versus neuron in the brain? Apparently about as many in the gut as a dog. Yeah, so what we're talking about here, we're talking about the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the enteric nervous system, which is a sort of a very complex and diversely populated nervous system that inhabits specifically the gut. And in fact, it is so complex that it's capable of operating independently of inputs from the central nervous system. In other words, if you were to just if you had some kind of wild futuristic technology where you could just wipe away all other neurophysiological components of the body and just left the enteric nervous system and the stuff that it regulated, it would still be able to function. Which is pretty remarkable. It has almost a full repertoire of neurotransmitters that we find in the brain. Importantly, though, and so we're talking about neurotransmitters like serotonin, one of my closest friends these days, and other neurotransmitters that you'd be familiar with. But importantly, the signaling of those molecules, of those neurotransmitters, is really only relevant within the enteric nervous system. So in other words, the serotonin that you find in the brain, or the GABA that you find in the brain, is not derived from the gut. So now, okay, so we have this extraordinarily complex nervous system. And when you say, a neuron in the central nervous system versus a neuron in the gut, a neuron is a neuron. They have largely the same components. What distinguishes them is to what other neurons are connected, the overall anatomy of the neuron. In other words, some neurons have a huge number of inputs, a large number of dendrites, a very broad dendritic tree. If you're interested, check out a Purkinje cell, for example, is this extraordinarily densely, Purkinje cell, which is quite common in the cerebellum, quite densely present in the cerebellum, has just this extremely complex set of dendrites that enables these neurons to receive a ton of different signals from a bunch of other neurons. Whereas, sensory neurons, for example, don't really have quite the same anatomy, but they all have a nucleus, they all have, Golgi bodies, they all have all the same organelles. And they all serve largely the same function as being an excitable cell. They can take in an input and fire an impulse and send that impulse elsewhere. So what distinguishes the there are a bunch of things that distinguish the central nervous system from the enteric nervous system, but most importantly for this conversation is the architecture of the central nervous system, the brain in particular, is obviously quite distinct from that of the enteric nervous system. And the most important difference is that the enteric nervous system could never give rise to consciousness, right? So if you have a big bucket of neurons, that does not a consciousness make, right? You have to have, and we don't know necessarily what the secret sauce is here, but there is a secret sauce to the architecture of how the neurons in the brain are connected to one another versus, just a bucket of neurons. And so, I could go on and on, what distinguishes the neurons in the human brain from that of a gorilla? And by the way, 10 points to Gryffindor for anybody who knows the taxonomic name for a gorilla, because it's very funny, at least to me. And I'm a nerd. But, what distinguishes the brain of a human from that of an elephant? Elephants have considerably more neurons in their brain than we do, but they're not quite as intelligent as humans. So what is that difference? And, I can't tell you with 100% certainty, but it almost certainly has something to do with the fact that we have many, many more neurons in the neocortex than they have in their cortex. And there is a unique architecture to, what parts of the human brain are communicating with what other parts of the human brain relative to other animals. I know that was a sort of circuitous way of saying, yes, we have this very complicated nervous system in our gut. It's capable of doing its job extraordinarily efficiently, but it is incapable of generating consciousness. All right. Does anybody know the name of gorilla? Do not look it up. That is totally cheating. I just said it. I need to get more sleep, folks. So the taxonomic name for the gorilla is gorilla. All right. I used to practice MMA. I did for a year, 3 times a week. What are the chances I have brain damage? I can't tell you for sure. Maybe there are some statistics on the percentage of folks who do mixed martial arts that develop brain damage, but there's a pretty substantial difference between Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And if I were to pick one, I would do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And really what it comes down to is just how frequently are you getting struck in the head, right? If you know that you were working on striking, that was your emphasis, as a result, you probably sparred a lot and did get hit in the head. You don't have to have a concussion to have meaningful damage that has long-term consequences. You can have subconcussive head injuries, and that can still have long-term ramifications later on. But if you were doing, BJJ, you probably weren't getting hit in the head nearly as much. And so as a result, completely different propensities for something like chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Yeah, then why are you here if you speak for everyone? You decided to do MMA. You already had it. No, that's not fair. There's quite a few neuroscientists who do MMA, but I don't think I've ever met a neuroscientist who did something other than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah. All right. Nobody gives an effing F. Andy Phi Cool. That's fair enough. I don't know if they give an effing F. Maybe they just give an F, right? I'd take an F. But what I would recommend to you, and I do study the brain after all, is to remove yourself from this digital environment and go do something that you do give an effing F about. Because it's a tragic waste of your limited time on this planet if you're doing something about which you don't give an effing F. How do you explain yourself? How do you live with yourself? All right. Thanks for coming on. It was my pleasure. I'm sorry I missed last week. I got a liter bottle of Morgan Spice smashed on my head. Whoa. That's probably something you want to go to a physician to make sure you don't have any damage to your brain. That is a non-trivial impact. All right. Does consciousness exist when we sleep? Mansurkali. So, does consciousness exist while we sleep? Absolutely. There's no question. It is just an altered state of consciousness, right? And I know that's usually associated with what happens when people take mind-altering drugs, psychoactive drugs, but absolutely. So in particular, this is quite tangibly demonstrated when you have a dream. A dream arises from a unique pattern of brain activity that really only occurs when we're sleeping. We think most frequently during REM sleep, which is a phase of our sleep cycle, during which we have quite a bit of brain activity that kind of resembles the brain activity that we exhibit when we're awake, but it has some important differences. Most, perhaps notably, being sort of lower levels of activity in forebrain structures when we're sleeping versus when we're awake. However, the exception is when we enter something called a lucid dream, where you sort of awaken to the fact that you were sleeping, and because you are dreaming, oftentimes you can sort of sculpt the trajectory of the dream in very exotic and interesting ways. During lucid dreams, there is a measurable, a distinctly heightened level of forebrain activity while somebody's sleeping and having a lucid dream compared to just your run-of-the-mill dream. But so, yeah, it's just a different state of consciousness. Yeah. Need a vacation. Someone please kidnap me. That's an interesting fantasy. Which one will be your choice? Love, money, or luck? I probably love. Gotta say. Probably love. Because I think it's easier to... I mean, you have to be pretty lucky to be able to fall in love with somebody that you really love. I certainly consider myself profoundly lucky. But yeah, I guess that's what I would do. I don't, my son, that tonight, do something you love because you're going to spend most of your life. Yeah, exactly. Totally. Football and hockey are sports where concussions are a major problem. Yeah, blonde wolf can. Yes, absolutely. Oh, I should. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, so I have a 9-month-old daughter, and I'm hoping to motivate her to play sports when she gets older. She's not very good at soccer yet, but we're working on it day and night. She's going to be a soccer star. No. But so as a result, I played basically every sport you could play in high school. I played football, lacrosse, soccer, football, and baseball. And then I did track when I stopped playing football because I was, believe it or not, and I know anybody that's familiar with football at any level is going to find this hard to believe, but I was a running back and fullback, and then our team was pretty small, so I also had to play cornerback. So that's offense and defense for the uninitiated. But there was, because I can run pretty fast, and usually our go-to move would be for me to run out on the outside because I could just run past those big oafs. But my coach was embarrassed that we kept running the same play, and so he really wanted me to run through what you call the holes, run through the gaps that your offensive line is supposed to push so that you can run through the middle. And we had a garbage offensive line, garbage, and so it never worked. But one time we were playing a game in the Florida Keys where the team was just gigantic. The guys were gigantic, and I got 2 concussions in one game, thus ending my otherwise prodigious career in professional football. No, and so I stopped playing football. My parents really were not that supportive of me playing. They didn't forbid me from doing it, which I suppose they could have. But after that, it was just like, yeah, no, this is over. I kid, but I don't really have the genes of a professional football player. But so as a result, I'm concerned about the sports that my daughter will play when she goes into high school. Or if we have a son, he will be forbidden from playing football. It's just not gonna be in the cards for him. But then, for girls, usually they don't play football to the same extent that American football to the same extent that guys do. But so as a result, girls get concussions from soccer. That's one of the leading causes of concussions among high schoolers in the United States, particularly women. And then actually wrestling is also a pretty common cause of concussions, evidently. But you're right. Yeah, hockey, football for sure. I'm going to try and incentivize tennis. Can you just do tennis? So, yeah, but it's something I'm pretty concerned about. Hey, Mew app. Good to see you, man. Hope all is well on your side of the planet. Wake up, smile, and tell yourself today's my day. Explain yourself, sir. Ian, is it common to do a neural network representation of a connectome after a voltage clamp? This is Abyss. Shocking. I was like, you know what this sounds like? Is it common to do a neural network representation of a connectome after voltage clamp? So, I mean, when you say is it common, like, I would wager that most people who do voltage clamp, for anybody that's not familiar with what we're talking about here, that is an electrophysiological technique. And basically what you're doing is a neuron is an excitable cell, right? So it can take an input and then fire an impulse or not fire an impulse. And one of the things that determines whether or not a neuron is going to fire an impulse is if a certain amount of excitation arrives at the neuron. And so, you can measure different things electrophysiologically, but one of the things you can do to measure how the neuron reacts to different levels of excitation, and this is a very abbreviated explanation, is that you can sort of hold the membrane potential, the level of excitation of a neuron at a specific voltage, and then you can see how the neuron responds to that voltage. You can get an idea of the biology or the electrophysiology of the neuron. But so, that's, pretty like meat and potatoes electrophysiology, and I would imagine most electrophysiologists don't have the background in computer science and programming to actually write the code for a neural network. I assume that's what representation of a neural network. So I don't think it's common. I think it's very sexy. So if you're in a situation where you can, that's pretty cool. I have not had the privilege. Remove yourself and watch a girl laying in bed saying nothing instead. The people who want to stay in your life will always find a way. That's very nice. Thanks for coming. Oh, yeah. Okay. Wait, I'm way behind. Whoa. Ian, how are you doing, my friend? Mrs. Little One doing well. You good? Asha, good to see you. Yes, they're doing very well. They are on a walk right now. My daughter is making all kinds of very wacky sounds. This was her go-to sound like 2 weeks ago. She would just do that over and over again, which was a graduation from that was her go-to, which was very cute. But now she just does these really, really high-pitched squeals, which is adorable to us. But, we were out at a restaurant yesterday for lunch, and, it's cute for a while. I think most people can only tolerate that kind of stuff for so long. But, I mean, she was very well behaved. She's a very, very good baby. And they're doing very well. What foods are good for keeping sharp during the day sans coffee? Well, so, I mean, what you're talking about is caffeine. And so, of course, you don't have to drink coffee to receive caffeine. I don't. I consume my caffeine in a sort of a combination of caffeine and branched-chain amino acids. And so, unfortunately, they make these things very, very sweet. I mean, it's not actually sugar, but it's sort of sweetened. But that's what I consume, because coffee, I drink an amount of caffeine where if I drank that amount to achieve that dose in coffee, I would just make myself sick. But you could drink tea, of course. I'm a big fan of tea. But, if you're interested in just not consuming caffeine but maintaining focus, there are obviously like the primary way to achieve that naturally would be to ensure you get enough sleep, or a good amount of sleep, not too much, not too little. People have different chronotypes, which is a term that we use to describe the different sort of genetic predispositions to different kinds of sleep. And so, your optimal duration of sleep might be 6 hours, whereas another might be 8 hours. Regardless, that is really what's going to largely determine whether or not you can sustain the sort of motivation and focus that you need, or that would be optimal during the day. Okay, so there's that. There's also, different eating patterns can be associated with different cognitive performances. I am an adherent to intermittent fasting, which I know is sort of very in vogue right now and is kind of irritating. And it just sounds like you're not eating, but you actually, the whole concept of intermittent fasting is that you consume, 3,000 calories or whatever, but you only consume it during a certain window of time during the day. For me, I found that it has been really beneficial in sustaining a sort of stable level of motivation and energy. So like, and then after I eat, I actually become pretty sedated and I just want to go to sleep, which is nice because I'm pretty bad at sleeping. So, you know, I don't know if that would be, you know, in the cards for you, but might be something worth looking into. But, you know, consuming like a whole bunch of carbohydrates, that'll probably sort of sedate you a bit. And so, yeah, apart from those two things, you know, I don't have, you know, there's no like, well, I guess, you know, you could consume yohimbine, which actually is used in research. Thank you very much for the super hearts. Boholkigai. Thank you very much. I recognize your handle, but I'm sure I brutalized the pronunciation for the last time that I saw it. But I appreciate the super hearts. Thank you. Very generous. So, yes. Oh, yeah, yohimbine, which is a panicogenic. So it's actually used in research for people who have panic disorder. It can be used to induce panic. Yohimbine has different pharmacology. It's oftentimes sort of in the same products that have caffeine in them. Like a lot of energy drinks have both yohimbine and caffeine, but they're different. Yohimbine is a more noradrenergic specific drug, pharmacologically speaking. Dunny. So, but you know, that will definitely, you know, give you more energy and give you more, you know, some more motivation. I find it really gross. I hate yohimbine, but people like it. But yeah, like apart from, you know, pharmacological strategies, it's not like there's a food that, you know, doesn't have any psychoactive effect, but is really good at sustaining focus, because after all, focus emerges from the brain. And so, you know, the best things you can do are just set yourself up to have, you know, gotten enough sleep, have a competent diet. You know, those are the kinds of things that will then ultimately determine, you know, fluctuations, let's say, in focus. Callie Q. Oh, wow. We got the one and only Top Shelf Pineapple calling in. It's our lucky day, everybody. So, thank you for calling in. Could you tell everybody your name and where you're calling from?
Hi, Ian. Good to speak to you. I'm Sonnen, and I'm actually calling from LA, but I'm in London.
Oh.
Normally. So, I don't know if you've spoken about this, and please just let me know so I can watch the replay if you have, but I want to talk a little bit about, like, food addiction, because that's something that I really kind of want to get to understand a little bit more. So I'm on a weight loss journey at the moment, and at the same time I know that sometimes I can be like an emotional eater, so I can just kind of like really, something triggers me and I need to kind of like go to that food and like, you know, eat it just for comfort or whatever. And I just wanted to understand a little bit more about that, really. Like, is it an addiction? Is it like a drug? Or, because some people debate and say, like, no, you can't be addicted to sugar, you can't be addicted to this. And it's like, well, then why do we reach for it so quickly when we, you know, when we want it or when we're desperate for it, kind of thing, you know? So yeah, I'd love to learn more about that, please.
Awesome topic. First of all, so it is not like a drug, right? That, you know, a drug is a specific thing, right? It has a specific biological relevance. And when it comes to drugs that alter the brain, addictive drugs like cocaine, let's say, or heroin, those drugs are capable of getting past the blood-brain barrier into the brain and bind and interact with neurotransmitter systems like dopamine, serotonin, and so on. So foods, you know, even very rewarding foods, let's say gelato, right? Delicious. Who doesn't like gelato? You know, even though it is very delicious, very appetitive, there's no molecules that interact with neurotransmitter signaling systems in the same way. Now, you're right that there is a pretty heated debate, contentious debate, as to whether or not there really is such a thing as, let's say, behavioral addictions, food addiction, gambling addiction, sex addiction. And, you know, from my perspective, I think it's largely a debate of semantics. There is absolutely no question that a lot of the same neurobiology that is activated or involved in the sort of the satiety, the it's not quite euphoria, but the comfort and, you know, just the deliciousness that one experiences when they have gelato or they have a food that they love, is very similar. It shares a lot of features with the neurobiology activated by a drug like cocaine or heroin. So there's that, right? There's certainly some overlap in the neurobiology of these two behaviors. But what I think is particularly interesting recently, and as we continue to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the neurobiology of addiction, I think this is going to become a very large component of our understanding, is that a lot of drug consumption, again, particularly alcohol, but nicotine, or cigarettes, pretty much any addictive drug, actually has a kind of appetitive quality to it. And by that I mean a lot of the same, disregarding the reward aspect of the drug, right? The most important reason that people will do the drug. A lot of the neurobiology involved in the consumption or the use of these drugs is also the neurobiology of food consumption. And so, I say this is most relevant for alcohol, of course, because you literally do ingest alcohol, and there is a flavor component to it that is very, very important. But there is now evidence emerging that our lab and labs with whom we work are generating that shows if you eliminate or if you inhibit, if you turn off parts of the brain that are activated by that sort of food consumption component of drug use, the reward of the drugs deteriorates. It's still rewarding, but it's not nearly as rewarding. And so, so it shares enough features with drug addiction, at least in my mind, to be considered, if not identical to drug addiction, in the same species, a close cousin. And, more, perhaps it might be more accurate to call it a compulsion. Regardless, it is a moment during which one's decision-making, one's free will, if you want to call it that, is compromised. And so as a result, it is extremely difficult. And it seems there also seems to be a substantial genetic component to appetite and metabolism. And there is also a very substantial genetic component to drug addiction. And so for me, I think we can see them through a very similar lens. So is this something you're struggling with at the moment? And please, don't feel obligated to share anything you're uncomfortable sharing.
No, that's fine. Actually, I can't see comments in the chat, so I might have to watch the replay for the comments. But I'll just have the discussion with you. So yeah, it is something I'm struggling with, only because I was, kind of very, very sort of adamant to lose weight before I came to the US, and I went to the gym like twice a day. I was eating well and I was doing my thing, and I lost a lot of weight. And then as soon as I came here, I'm like, oh my god, food, America, I need it. Like, and I just tried like everything. Oh my god, Olive Garden, can I just say, it's so good.
That's so funny. Yeah.
But my point is like, I because sometimes I think you can beat yourself up thinking like you're doing something wrong, when in actual fact it's almost like an emotional attachment you've got to that feeling of like wanting to feel comfort when you're feeling sad or stressed or anxious or something like that. And I think it's like I was doing so well, and then I don't think I've kind of gone off the rails completely. However, it's almost like you just kind of torture yourself because you think it's like your fault for doing that, when in actual fact you've probably built this habit up for a very long time. Like mine came through my depression for when I was depressed from the age of 13 or 14 or something, and it came through kind of just my past and why I got emotionally attached to food in the first place. So I guess it's almost like teaching your brain a new way to behave or to live. And I think I do that for a while, but then when I get into like a different emotional state, it just kind of just seeps back in slowly, and I'm like, oh well, it's only a little bit, I'll be fine, I'll work out later or something, so so it's just something that I'm trying to work on, because I've got another month out here, and I'm like, I need to do something with this whole month that I have and just kind of get back on track. But
so first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, those rationalizations that you just sort of described, like, oh, I'll work out tomorrow, or I'll diet extra hard tomorrow. Those are very similar rationalizations that drug addicts will also exhibit. Like, yeah, okay, I'm going to drink X, Y, this amount tonight. Okay, I won't do it next week. And it's sort of they give themselves permission to indulge, and they rationalize the indulgence. And in the case when somebody's in recovery from drug addiction, that is literally a relapse, right? But, to even step back a little bit further, I mean, you're 100% correct. I mean, the relationship between emotionality and food consumption is a very direct one. And, I mean, if you think about the evolutionary biology of the brain, why do we even have emotion, right? The most important, the most critical things that humans did in our early evolutionary period was reproduce, obviously. And of course, that can feel pretty good. But then also get access to nutrients, make sure you eat enough to survive. And so essentially all of our motivation, all of our emotions are devoted to and deeply influenced by food consumption. So yeah, I mean, this is a very deep, ancient system that in some folks is more frustratingly stubborn than in others. There's a variety of reasons for that, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in the U.S. Oh, there was one more thing. So you said, the Olive Garden is so delicious, and I don't disagree. But what was funny is, I don't know if you know Deanna Hooper, who's a cosmologist, another scientist. She came to Philly, and she lives in Europe. She's lived, I believe, in Germany for quite a while, but then other parts, I believe, in Europe as well. And, an American perception of European food is like, it doesn't get any better than French food or, whatever. But so she was like, we were just walking through Philly and she saw a cheesecake factory. And she was like, can we try this? And of course, my reaction was like, you want American cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory? And she's like, yes. And so we go and we, get cheesecake. And she's like, this is so much. Like, this is so delicious. And so yeah, you're not alone in finding some of the classic American chains as being very rewarding.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes from actually like the hype of it being built up as well. Like when you're watching TV in the US, like in the UK, or watching other people eat like on Periscope or something, and you're like, you want to try all of it because it's a new territory for you. So it's like, oh well, I have to go out and try this. And yeah, it can be a little bit challenging, but I'm just trying to kind of get myself back to where I was. So I just wanted a little bit more of an understanding to that. But thank you so much.
Sure. I mean, one last thing that, and I'm a big advocate of this, but look into something called intermittent fasting. You'll be able to eat.
Oh, yeah.
So are you familiar with that?
Yeah, so
okay.
That's what I was doing before I got here, was that I used to eat from like 2 to 8 was my window. And then I'd go to the gym at 6:30 in the morning, and then come home, and then I'd have something between 2 to 8, and then go to the gym before, like, at 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock or something like that. And that is what honestly helped me lose the most weight. Like, it was so good. Like, I've tried everything about with weight loss, and that was the thing that's worked for me the most.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that I'm kind of trying to get back on.
Awesome. Well, Sonam, it was really a privilege to get to talk to you again after so long. And if anybody is unfamiliar with Sonam, which I would be shocked if that was the case, you should check her out. She goes live pretty frequently. So Sonam, thanks so much for calling in.
Thank you, Ian. Take care.
You too. How lovely to speak to one of the loveliest people on Periscope. There's no question. On Twitter. Interesting conversation. Oh gosh, we have several other callers in. All right, Taruk, I believe, is the name of the next caller. So Taruk, is that your name?
Sorry, what did you say?
So, what's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Tariq. I'm calling from Tampa, Florida.
Tariq, awesome, from Tampa. What's on your mind?
Just wanted to ask you something. Yesterday I had a relative. I was just wanting to get some clarity, maybe, since you understand the brain, obviously. And I appreciate all your posts in regards to your lectures. They seem like, PhD level courses. I appreciate that.
It's my pleasure.
Very intuitive. So I had a relative 2 days ago, went to the hospital. I didn't know that he was suffering from alcoholism. So I didn't know that. And he's very young, like recent college grad. He's an attorney. So I'm like, what the hell? So yesterday he goes back to the hospital. They give him IVs and stuff. And he's, obviously close to having seizures. I didn't realize alcohol was that bad.
Oh.
But then he gets to a doctor yesterday and he's able to get benzos.
Yeah.
And he's totally fine.
Yeah.
Like he's not having to get the alcohol. So I'm just like, how is that working?
Yeah. It's very interesting. So, of course, I don't know all of the details here, but generally speaking, when somebody consumes quite a bit of alcohol regularly, and this is actually kind of a pretty big problem in colleges in the United States right now. Of course, over time you develop a tolerance, and that tolerance arises from actual physical changes that occur in the brain to adapt to the chronic presence of this drug, and it's doing that because it automatically will change itself to reapproach what we call homeostasis, or its sort of baseline, what the brain looked like before you ever consumed a drug. And so it changes the number of receptors that are available. It changes the amount of neurotransmitter that's released. And perhaps most importantly for this is it can reduce the level of signaling, the sort of the volume of a signaling system called GABA. And that is the nervous system's principal off signal, inhibitory signal. And so because the alcohol sort of masquerades a little bit as GABA, and so the brain turns down its own GABA volume. But then, of course, when you cease intake of the alcohol, there's no longer any ethanol masquerading as GABA. The brain has insufficient levels of GABA signaling, and as a result, it doesn't have sufficient off signaling, and somebody can develop seizures. And that is part of the fairly dangerous withdrawal syndrome from alcohol. It can be life-threatening, and so it's really good that he had access to care. And so now benzodiazepines, they are a family of drugs. Probably people, if you're not familiar with that word, you might be familiar with Valium or Xanax or Klonopin. Those are all benzodiazepines. And what they do is they stimulate, let's say they activate that GABA receptor such that when your brain's GABA binds it, it becomes more sensitive. And so it's sort of like turning the volume of GABA back up. But what's useful about, and so as a result, they can protect you from having those seizures, from having that withdrawal symptom. But of course, what's nice about benzodiazepines in a clinical setting is that, alcohol is an intoxicant. It inebriates you, and it is also toxic to, your peripheral organ system. Benzodiazepines are not. And so as a result, you can mitigate the withdrawal syndrome from alcohol and, of course, avoid having seizures and and then also avoid the toxic effects of alcohol on the peripheral physiology by using a benzodiazepine. And then I would assume that your friend's physicians are planning to ultimately wean him off of the benzodiazepines as well, because you can also undergo seizures if you stop using benzodiazepines if you've been taking them for a very long time. Benzos and alcohol share that. But of course, if a physician's prescribing the benzodiazepines, they are well aware of that, and that'll be part of their therapeutic plan.
Okay, I really appreciate your time. I don't want to take any more time of your time up. I'm sure there's people that have questions, but dude, that was so amazing. I have much more clarity now on what the heck is going on, because I never been exposed to that, so I was kind of like, what the heck?
Tariq, yeah, I mean, I can only imagine how alarming it is, and it's my pleasure. Good luck. Hope for the best for your friend.
Hey, thank you so much. God bless you. Keep up the great work.
Likewise. You know what's wild? So, I'm finishing up my time in graduate school among the PhDs in biomedical science. If you walk into a bar and you have the choice to sit next to a philosophy PhD, a biomedical, neuroscience PhD, or, physics, chemistry, go sit next to the neuroscientist. You're going to have a far more interesting conversation than the frustratingly argumentative conversation with the philosophy PhD, or the conversation devoid of any social graces of any of the other PhDs. But, I have friends that are in other programs that, for example, are getting their law degree or their MBA, their business degree, and their MDs, their medical students. And boy, the lawyer student, the law students and the business students and the medical students, but particularly the law students, they drink a lot. It was wild. like I actually have a pretty solid tolerance. We had a conversation previously about why it is that some people can drink an amount of alcohol that would normally make somebody pretty intoxicated and inebriated, but they don't exhibit any of those behaviors, and I have that, unfortunately. And so I can drink a good amount of alcohol before I start encountering problems. The amount of alcohol they were drinking, just shot after shot of like tequila. Oh. So yeah, I mean, for people going into law school or med school, I mean, that's a thing to pay attention to, because you can develop a problem. And it seems very like intrinsic to the social experience too. Do I hear shameless self-promotion? Well, like in neuroscience does. No, I'm just saying, like, of course, there are exceptions. There are interesting people in all these fields. But generally speaking, you have to be a special kind of weird to go into neuroscience. And that can be like dorky weird. That can be like nerdy, sort of like obsessed about a specific component of consciousness. Or, it can be, neuroscience is a fundamentally generalist or interdisciplinary field. So you can be interested in a whole bunch of different things. So that's why I say neuroscience PhD students are the most interesting PhD students. Thank you very much for the super heart, Novocaine for the soul. Very generous. And thank you, Asha, too, for the super hearts. Novocaine, for anybody that's not familiar, is a very interesting drug. If you go into the dentist's office and they need to numb part of your mouth, this is another thing, by the way, that I have inherited. I require massive amounts of Novocaine, or Procaine is another one that they can use. Sometimes not benzocaine. Bupivacaine is another one that they'll use. But yeah, I mean, the amount that they have to inject is just like, it's pain. It's very frustrating because they're sticking a needle in your gums, and evidently that is a thing that is known, that people with Northern European ancestry tend to require massive amounts of these drugs. And what these drugs do, it's very interesting, very simple pharmacological effect. What they do, and this is true for cocaine too, by the way, is they basically prevent a very small little part of a neuron called the sodium ion channel, which is critical. The sodium ion channel is arguably the most important part of a neuron that enables it to fire an impulse. So if you block sodium ion channels, a neuron will be incapable, will be totally silent. And as a result, that's why those sensory neurons, when they're silent, you can no longer feel, you're not barely even aware of that part of your mouth. And so Novocaine for the soul, it numbs the soul. It's a very lovely pharmacology joke. That's me with the numbing. Yeah, lidocaine is another one. Yeah, for sure. Funny you're not that interesting. Lawyers tell better stories than anything I heard from you. Well, fair enough. I don't know what to tell you. I could tell you some interesting stories, but nobody's asked me about interesting things. No, I'm kidding. I'm not saying I am more interesting than law students or anything like that. I'm just saying, on the whole, the conversation, if you're interested in, these very profound topics. But no, some of my best friends are business students. That's pretty funny. Some, I assume, are good people. All right. Can I ask you a serious physics question, or of you, my friend? Yes, of course, you can ask whatever comes to your mind. I can't promise a competent response, though, because I am only a physicist to the extent that physics interferes with neurobiology. All right. Getting another caller from a gentleman who I believe goes by the name of Jesus, perhaps Jesus. Jesus, is that your name?
Yeah, I'm Magnus.
Magnus.
I'm called Jesus on the internet, but my worldly name is Magnus.
Worldly name is Magnus. Sounds very cool. What's on your mind, Magnus? Oh wait, I'm sorry, Magnus. I'm sorry. One more question. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Sweden.
From Sweden. Okay, very cool. Thank you. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm wondering. I'm having this drug Abilify. Do you know it?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, what does it do with the dopamine?
So Abilify is it's aripiprazole. That's the non-trade name name of the drug, and it's in the category of atypical antipsychotics because it has a sort of a diverse pharmacology. And so specifically, it interacts with more than just dopaminergic receptors. It influences serotonin signaling, dopamine signaling, adrenergic signaling, and acetylcholine signaling. But with regards to dopamine in particular, I believe it is a dopamine D2 agonist. The details don't matter.
That's a lot of sorry, that's a lot of terms. I can't handle it really.
Okay, so
because the English is so high.
yeah, let me simplify it. Let me simplify it a little bit. So what Abilify does is it changes the way that specific neurons in the brain communicate with one another, and it changes it in such a way as to sort of hopefully, if there is a therapeutic effect, bring that pattern of signaling to be closer to what resembles a sort of a more typical pattern of brain activity.
Okay.
And so it can be useful for the treatment of depression. It can be useful for the treatment of various psychosis-associated conditions.
They have said I have paranoid schizophrenic.
Yeah, there you go.
So, but I'm quite normal. But they believe that I need these chemical drugs. I call them chemical drugs because I don't want them. I think that I'm spiritual, and it's a label with paranoid schizophrenic. It's a label over my spirituality.
Yeah, I mean, listen. Of course, no expert in spirituality or theology or anything, but so schizophrenia, I think, is one of the most interesting things to study. Some of the most important figures in history have probably had schizophrenia. One of my favorite science fiction authors was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and there's an interesting evolutionary biology behind why it is that some folks are born that ultimately develop schizophrenia, and there is this there's an anthropological evaluation of okay, it can be very difficult for some folks to live with schizophrenia if it's untreated, but there's also a certain value that anthropologists would argue to having a low frequency but a predictable frequency of folks with schizophrenia, because they're able to see the world in this very interesting way, and that it can sort of provide the society around them with a sort of an axis mundi, right? Like a way to think about the world in a less concrete, less tangible way that can be very helpful. But that said, I mean, schizophrenia can be an extremely debilitating condition if it's not treated with the nuance and the competence that it really requires.
I'm wondering like this. I asked my psychiatrist, what if I blocked your dopamine signals? What would happen to you? Because she said, your spirituality, as the scientist said, is in one part of the brain, and the schizophrenia is in another part of the brain. So it's not the same. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, what is schizophrenia really? What is it?
Yeah, I mean,
if you identify it.
It's a very interesting topic. We continue to study schizophrenia. It's obviously it's distinct from something like depression or panic disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, and it can be very diverse in its presentation. It can involve, of course, hallucinations, most frequently auditory hallucinations, though sometimes also visual hallucinations. And one description of schizophrenia that I have come across that I find interesting is that, of course, what it specifically is a difference in the way that a person's brain is connected, right? A difference in the architecture of the brain. But what
we're wired. We with schizophrenia are wired in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. But what can happen though is that part of the way that the human brain interacts, navigates the world, is it makes predictions about its environment. So, for example, I am unconsciously, totally unconsciously, I'm predicting that right now my air conditioner is on. Right now my lights are off, except for that one. I'm making a prediction that there's not somebody with a machete outside of my front door. And so you make those predictions so that, and again, it's not conscious, it's totally subconscious. But then when something changes in your environment that you didn't predict, all of a sudden the air conditioner hasn't been on for 2 hours. Then you notice it. Then you notice, wait, it's supposed to be on, it's not on, there's a change in my environment. So one explanation of schizophrenia that I've seen is that this unique brain architecture results in a sort of a difference in the balance between how much the environment influences your conception of reality versus how your prediction of reality influences your perception, right? Which I know it's sort of
That's hard English.
that's so what?
That's hard English to understand.
Yeah. Okay. So think of it this way.
Perception and all this.
Think of it like a seesaw, right? So a seesaw is like, where there's two kids that sit on either end of a board, a plank of wood.
Okay,
Yeah. And so when somebody does not have schizophrenia, there is this sort of balance between, one side of the seesaw being the external environment and the other side of the seesaw being the internal conception of reality, right? So it's sort of balanced like this, right? And sometimes one is higher than the other, but they can go back and forth.
Okay, let me see, Ian, if I understand.
Sure.
My inner perception isn't the same as my outer perception.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay.
And
if I say like this, I'm a very spiritual person. Okay, that's my foundation. I have a very strong faith in Jesus. I have shaved the cross on my chest, so I have it, bring it with me always. But anyway, what I'm doing is just to say that I think my spirituality is so strong, so that they don't like me, the psychiatrists, because they can't figure me out, kind of, if I say so.
I see what you're saying, and of course I'm unfamiliar with Sweden. I know it's a pretty comparatively secular society, but my expectation would be these are people who are trained to respect the personal beliefs of any patient, and they.
I don't think so. Just a moment, Ian.
Sure.
My psychiatrist, the one I used to have earlier, now I have a new one. But the earlier one, he said that God is a hallucination. So that's his way to see it, and I can't figure that out.
Well, I mean,
The God is the creator. He has made every DNA neuron cells of a soul.
Well, I mean, far be it from me to criticize how a physician, provides treatment, right? I'm not a physician. My suspicion would be that you would be unlikely to encounter that in the United States. But, it could be that your physician is specifically describing specific experiences that you've had, right? Rather than your belief system as a whole. But beyond, we're now exploring territory where my expertise is not particularly insightful.
Okay.
And so
I'm talking about the brain.
But so just one last thing. So the issue with schizophrenia, one of the challenges in managing it, is to exploit the benefits, exploit the immense creativity and dynamic consciousness that can arise from it, while also avoiding what can be debilitating. And one can develop these very elaborate delusions that can be life-threatening. And so the goal, we don't have a perfect tool to enable people to do that. Abilify is one tool, and it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But it's important that people with schizophrenia here. One last thing, Magnus.
Yeah, the drugs don't make me function. I think that schizophrenia is a label for spirituality, and it's a strength.
Well, the thing is, it's not that simple. It's really not that simple. For example, one of the most important mathematicians in human history, John Nash, came up with game theory. He had schizophrenia, pretty severe schizophrenia. And, while in some cases...
What was the label for him? What was he suffocating from, really?
Well,
was it hearing voices or what? I mean, that's demons.
Well, so it was auditory...
I don't hear voices.
It was both auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. But listen, again, I can't tell you, I can't help you beyond what a physician can help you. But one of the challenges in living with schizophrenia is the medications aren't perfect, but they're important to enabling somebody to live a stable life. and avoid any damaging consequences. But oftentimes people with schizophrenia come to the conclusion that they no longer need the medication, and that can precipitate a fairly dangerous set of events to occur. And so, my recommendation would be to work with your physician. If you feel like your physician is not respecting your personal, religious views, find another one. But it is important to work with the tools that we have available so that you can live, a high quality of life and enjoy the benefits.
Absolutely.
And avoid the
but
deficits.
You know what the real trouble is? I haven't had one session of talk therapy during 20 years. Only chemicals I had.
That's unfortunate.
It is, because the brain works with talking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, listen, Magnus. I hope that the best of luck with your treatment. I hope things improve.
Thanks for the advices. And I needed to know what Abilify is, because I get them monthly. One shot every month, and it's forced upon me by the psychiatrist. I can't avoid it. Then the police get me, and because I quit medication earlier, and they didn't like that I did that. But I want to be myself. I don't want to be someone they want me to be.
Yeah. I understand. I can only sympathize. But
it's okay. Thank you, Ian. I won't take your time anymore.
Thank you so much for calling in, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Super interesting topic, schizophrenia. And actually, I did a poor job of articulating this, but Robert Sapolsky, one of the best neuroscience instructors in the world, I would argue, has an excellent way of articulating the evolutionary benefit of having some folks who have just this unique brain architecture that results in what was almost certainly in the past what would be considered schizophrenia. All right. So does cannabis kill brain cells? There's no evidence that it kills brain cells. However, there is evidence that it changes the architecture of the brain for very extended periods of time. And it's still unclear as to whether or not those changes are permanent. But most of the evidence suggests there are no permanent changes to the brain that occur following chronic cannabis use, chronic use. But it does most certainly alter like white matter, gray matter volumes. The relevance of that is the functional relevance of that is still sort of up for debate. And I think it's always important to note, because I think advocates neglect to mention this, prohibitionists overemphasize this, but there are some folks for whom cannabis can be a precipitating event for psychosis or an anxiety attack or a panic attack, and it can sort of begin a recurring psychiatric phenomenon. So, excuse me. And so this is a small proportion of the population who reacts to cannabis in this way. We actually can identify, we can articulate why it is that some of these folks respond in this way. One example is a mutation in the genes that encode an enzyme called catechol O-methyltransferase, or COMT, which is an enzyme that degrades dopamine levels. It's particularly active in the forebrain, in the prefrontal cortex. And it seems to be the case that people who have a slight mutation in the gene that encodes that enzyme, when they're exposed to cannabis, they're much more likely to react with psychosis or an anxiety attack than folks who don't have that mutation, that single nucleotide polymorphism. And that's just one example. But again, that is a minority of the population. For, generally speaking, it is a fairly benign drug relative to other drugs people do recreationally. All right. Let me see. How long? Gosh, they've been on their walk for a while, huh? Why can't we recall many details from our dreams? What is preventing this from happening? So yeah, super interesting topic. So the short answer is we don't know for sure. We know quite a bit about dreaming. And in fact, I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and you can find it on Stitcher and iTunes and Alexa. She's listening, so I don't want her to start talking. Oh my gosh. She's so verbose. But Wired to be Weird, and I have a podcast. I actually have 2 episodes, I believe, devoted entirely to dreams. We talk about lucid dreaming. We talk about why it is that humans would dream in the first place. Is there some kind of evolutionary benefit to it? What does it do? What could it be for biologically? But we still don't understand everything that there is to understand about dreams. And we, of course, don't understand everything there is to understand about memory. We still have quite a bit to learn there. But I think informed speculation would be that when you form a memory from a normal experience, and we're specifically talking about episodic memory, which is a specific kind of memory, as opposed to like procedural memory, for example. You remember how to ride a bike. That's not episodic memory. Episodic memory is like you remember a conversation you had last night when you went out with your friends, right? So when so when you form those memories, you have all of this incoming sensory information. You remember what your friends were wearing, what your friend's hair looked like, what it smelled like in the bar, or the restaurant, wherever you were, what the lighting was like, what emotions you were feeling. That's not incoming sensory signaling, but it's also integrated into this memory that you may or may not form. When you're dreaming, of course, all of those experiences are being internally generated. You're not deriving the sensation of seeing, I'm trying to remember a recent dream that I had. You're not literally seeing yourself flying over Center City, Philadelphia, right? Obviously. But your visual cortex is in some way generating some of the activity that would need to occur for you to perceive yourself flying over a city. So you don't have that sort of that sensory weighting, that sensory confirmation of this experience. It's not as strong of a signal, in other words. And so it could be the case that in the absence of that, you just the systems that are responsible for coordinating the storage of memory just aren't receiving nearly as strong of a signal that this is relevant, that this is worth conserving, and therefore storing. And so as a result, it's just difficult to remember some of those dreams. On the flip side, why is it that we can remember some dreams? And now I'm definitely speculating here because there is no answer available. So this is speculation. Part of a dream is the emotional valence, the emotional experience of the dream, right? You can have a nightmare, which is very memorable, or you can have a very euphoric, very pleasurable dream, right? On either end, these are very extreme emotional states that are, again, internally generated, just pseudo-randomly, not randomly, but pseudo-randomly. And part of how we determine whether or not an experience is worth conserving, worth remembering, is the emotional states that we were experiencing in those moments, right? So you're much more likely to remember a traumatic experience than you are a mundane experience, right? And that's part of the reason why some people will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, is that just the severity of the emotional signaling that was occurring in that moment was so high that this, was clearly an important life experience. And so when it comes to a dream, if you experience those very severe emotional states, then you're more likely potentially to remember them, because that is part of the system that we use to determine whether or not something is worth remembering in the first place. But if you're interested in dreams, and for example, when we have the greatest frequency of brain activity that we associate with dreams, or how some people try and train themselves to have lucid dreams, check out my podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher. And let me know what you think. All right. Oh, wow. Okay. Somali Tiz Med Halib canceled their call. Oh, but we have other calls. All right. Keep bumping stuff. So I believe we are about to connect with a gentleman named Corey. Please correct me if I'm incorrect there. It's taking a while to connect here. You can train yourself to have certain dreams. Yeah, well, some people are moderately successful at increasing the frequency that they have lucid dreams. Excuse me. Gosh, so it seems like Corey is not connecting. So we will... okay, let's try a different caller who goes by the handle Big Tan, number 1. Euromaestro, I see you just joined. What's up, man? Hope all is well on your side of the Atlantic. Seems like... oh, here we go. So Big Tan, what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Hello.
Hi, what's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm from Kosovo. My name is Victor.
You're from where?
Kosovo.
Kosovo?
Yes.
Okay, so Big Tan from Kosovo, what's on your mind?
What is this brain science test?
Okay, sure. So I'm finishing my PhD in neuroscience, which is a science devoted to asking questions about and doing our best to answer the nature of human consciousness, how our brain works, how our nervous system works, and in particular for me, how the brain encodes anxiety as well as addiction. Listen, I'm getting all kinds of crazy feedback right now, so I'm going to let you go. I'm sorry about that, but it's just, yeah, there's a lot of echoing. Oh, looks like we just missed. He was trying to troll. Oh, man. All right, Corey looks like is calling back in. So, Corey, is that your name?
You got it, buddy.
So where are you calling from?
Calling from Canada.
Corey from Canada. What's on your mind?
Let's talk about some demons since we were talking about something about schizophrenia the last dude that was on.
Okay, I mean, demons are certainly not part of my my expertise, but if we can talk more about schizophrenia, if you're interested.
Yeah, let's get something about that one, and let's talk about it, and let's see what you think, because you know so much about a brain, how the brain works and all that. I'll tell you my story here, okay? I've been a drinker for 25 years, okay? Alcoholism, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I used to play the Ouija board when I was young, a lot of cocaine, a lot of drugs, a lot of everything, okay? Now, the thing with, we always talked about, like, everybody, you think about schizophrenia is people see hallucinations and who's all this and this and this and that. So anyways, day 4 of being sober, okay, of 25 years, okay, so what's going on here is, I had some problems with work or whatever, I took the week off, so I come home, no drinking, no nothing, I'm laying in bed and I get a grunting sound. I turn to look up out of my bed, it's about 4 a.m. in the morning and it's grunting, I look up and this face manifestations, it starts lowering itself, manifesting so many different faces to me, and I look at it, I'm just in a period of 3 seconds, I close my eyes, I turn my head, I look beside my bed and I open my eyes, there's an imprint in my bed, I close my eyes and I go, okay, this is a demon, and I'm like, this is I keep my eyes closed, okay, and all of a sudden I hear a baby crying. I open my eyes right beside my bed, the blanket's going up, I'm underneath the blanket, it's going up and down, and a baby's crying. I start kicking, literally kicking it with my foot, it's like hitting a brick, and I can't do nothing. So I'm like, this is just insane. And then as at the end of the bed, there's a head, that old lady, about 180-year-old woman that pops up at the end of the bed, and like her gray hair, and I'm like, okay, this is out of the ordinary. I get up, I grab my phone, I go in the living room, I turn on my TV, I try to ignore it. And remember, this is day 4, no alcohol, and it's not hallucination, it's not nothing with the brain, and this is summer too, so I'm starting to freeze, so I give my breath in the air and it's ice cold, and I'm like, okay, I have a demon here. I grab a beer, I say, you win, and I start drinking, left me alone. So you tell me what's going on with that. All right.
Well, I'm sorry to hear this experience. I mean, that sounds extraordinarily traumatic. So just to make sure that I got the timing right here. So you were a pretty heavy drinker for about 25 years. Is that what you said?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So, okay. So alcohol, like when somebody drinks alcohol, that much alcohol for that long, it changes the brain, right? And part of that change is that, that change occurs because the brain is adapting to the chronic presence of this drug and changing so that it begins to resemble something almost normal, almost as though it hadn't been exposed to the drug. But then if you, and 25 years is quite a long time to drink heavily. And if you remove the alcohol from the system, the brain has to readapt, has to go back to normal, but that takes a long time. It takes more than 4 days. And so there's a withdrawal syndrome that occurs when somebody stops taking any drug, alcohol included, but any drug, after a long period of time. Nicotine also, if somebody smokes all the time and they stop smoking, they have a withdrawal syndrome. But alcohol, the withdrawal syndrome is far more severe than most other drugs. In fact, it can be life-threatening. Somebody can experience seizures and potentially die. But because humans have consumed alcohol for so long, for almost all of recorded history, we have a name for the withdrawal syndrome from alcohol. We call it delirium tremens. And so that's 2 words, delirium tremens. And part of it is the seizures that people can experience, but part of it is a set of hallucinations. And they're almost exclusively very aversive because, of course, alcohol relaxes you. It calms you down. It feels good. But so as you're undergoing withdrawal, the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. And so you feel the opposite of the calming effects of alcohol. And you feel very aversive and very alert. It can be almost impossible to go to sleep because the alcohol used to sedate you. And so, far be it from me to try and explain away the nuances of this experience. I've never experienced something like that. But I can tell you for sure that a lot of people who are undergoing withdrawal from alcohol have had very similar experiences. And they go away once the withdrawal syndrome has been completed.
Can I tell you round 2 what happened here? Now, just for more evidence, and then I'm going to get to what happened when I went to the priest, a father who actually, I'll get to the second thing, okay? So anyways, what happens is I had some issues because being an alcoholic, people are getting violent and dangerous. Anyways, I did something to somebody. They came back during the night when I was passed out. I woke up to a kick to the head by 5 guys, beat. I came out with a knife. I almost stabbed this guy on the property. They were hitting me over the head with a 2x4, and I was still going at him like something was in me, like a demon of some sort, and like a psychotic. Anyways, all in all, I couldn't go back to the property. I was homeless. I was sleeping in my car, and the same thing. I was on a no drinking order, so I'm sleeping on the side of this lake, okay? And it's about 4 a.m. I'm get off work. I get off at 11 o'clock. So around 4 a.m. I hear the same thing, grunting. And I'm like, it's back, but I kept my eyes closed. I know what's going on. I kept grunting. I opened my eyes, and this thing just squeals right in front out of my car into a tree. I grabbed, and it's just shaking, branches are breaking. I grabbed my phone. I'm recording it. The sounds, everything was on there. It was, at that time, it was, it's an old phone. You can't see anything. Anyways, what happens is I see everything what's going on. Something's hopping on this, on the lake, jumping like a skip rock, and it just goes up in the air. And I had this all on recording, like not the sounds and everything, but not the video part of it. Now, the thing is, there's more to it. Now, I ended up getting a hotel, living in a hotel for the month. And I'm laying on the couch watching TV, and I'm getting this ember in my hair, like a fire thing. And I grab my phone, I'm recording it, and I'm pretty much knocking it out. And it goes in another part, and another part, another part. And I'm getting harassed. I can't sleep, 4 days of no sleep. Remember, I'm cleaned up here, right? And someone's playing with my hair, tickling my face. I'm like, this is a demon. It's demonic. It's got to be. This is not alcohol. This is insane. So my mother says, go to a Catholic, because we're Catholics, get him. So I go and I show him the evidence. He goes in the back, gets me all this stuff. Once he puts his hand on my forehead and sprays me, I'm hopping. My father's sitting beside me. He's an atheist. He's like, I've never seen this I'm like, I told you, man, I'm not going crazy here. This is no mental illness. This is no nothing. There's a demon, because what it wants me to do is drink and die. That's what his goal is. Now I'm clean. I haven't drank in 6 months now, but I think he extracted out of me. I don't know. I still feel a little tingling on my cheek. I think it's still here. I don't know. It's like a worm in my face. But ever since this demon church, maybe that's what it doesn't want. Demons are very powerful. They're strong. They can manipulate manifestation. But that's why I'm trying to explain. If you can understand, a lot of the doctors and nurses, like if I told this story in a hospital, they'd put me in a mental institute. They'd say, you're crazy.
I mean, I'm not a physician, but, Corey, my reaction is you're not the only person who describes confronting addiction as a demon, right? That's actually very common. And people have very similar experiences when they're trying to get off a drug like alcohol. So you're not alone, and you're not nuts. But what I would emphasize to you, and again, I cannot tell you for sure what you're experiencing, but what I can tell you for sure is that you're not the only person who's had experiences like this when they're trying to quit. Alcohol is a very significant drug to be addicted to, and the withdrawal can be life-threatening. Now, if you've been clean for 6 months, that is a remarkable achievement, and that's no joke. I mean, it's very difficult to maintain sobriety like that, so congratulations. But listen, beyond that, beyond just letting you know that it's actually pretty common for people to see addiction as a demon that they have to confront. Whatever you call it, that is a shared common component of this experience. But beyond that, I don't really have any more expertise for you. What I appreciate, though, you describing your experiences to us, and best of luck with continuing sobriety, man.
I just wanted to bring that up for a lot of these people that end up in these mental houses. I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think 80% should be. I think demons manipulate their mind to put them in there and lock them in there, and that's their goal. Their goal is to take us all. And I'm not a very church guy either. I was an atheist. Until I see this demon, I do believe there is demons. I haven't seen God, but I do believe if there's a demon, there's a God, right?
All right. Well, listen, Corey, I appreciate you calling in. I appreciate you calling in, and best of luck with continuing your sobriety. And I hope to talk to you again in the future, and let me know how things are going.
Sounds good, buddy.
All right. Thanks for calling.
Much, man.
Bye.
Yeah, bye now.
Yeah, I mean, I know for somebody who's never encountered addiction, never encountered alcoholism, I can imagine some folks being like, what is this guy talking about? This is wild. But addiction is extraordinarily life-shattering. And, people, it is one of the most severe, aversive, life-shattering experiences somebody and their family can deal with. And as a result, people understand it in different ways. And whether it's see it as a demon, you see it as just pure pharmacology and neurobiology, it doesn't matter. If you're achieving sobriety for 6 months, that's an achievement. And whatever you're doing is working. Keep it up. So, guys, I know the girls, I think, just got home. I think. So, as much as I'd love to stick around, I should probably call it a day. Oh, and Euromaestro is calling in. I'm so sorry, man. But I really do have to go. I hope you'll forgive me for this. But for everybody else, I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify and pretty much wherever fine podcasts are found. I also, earlier, did a talk about e-cigs and this recent wave of regulatory responses to this spate of over 1,000 lung injuries from from vaping. So I talked about it. It's a complicated topic. It's not as simple as I think most people would expect, but that's on YouTube. And so my channel is called Anthropoid, but you can probably just get there by typing in Ian McLaughlin Brain. Otherwise, I hope to see a lot of you, same place, same time next Sunday. And have a great beginning of your week. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. See you guys. All right, and goodbye, YouTube.